Thank you very much for joining us. This is our training session for Make Votes Matter called Speaking with Confidence about PR. So I know many of our activists have asked us over some of our previous sessions about a bit of sort of training and things for how to talk about PR, some of the arguments for and against, and responding to some of the sort of key questions that tend to come up. This evening we have 4 speakers that will be joining us. All of them are part of the movement for PR, and we will obviously be sort of going through all of the key different aspects. So I'll introduce them quickly now. I think the structure is we'll let all 4 of them speak, so that some of the questions that you may have may be answered by the next person, and then we'll do questions at the end of the session. So please use the chat for questions. If you can write the word question at the front, when you have a question in the chat, that'll help us to spot them much more quickly, and that would really help us if that's all right. We're recording the session, we'll share it on our YouTube channel as well, so if you're having to leave early or anything like that, then we should be able to watch it back again. Okay, so our speakers this evening are a very illustrious bunch. So starting with Owen Winter, he is a student, an activist, and also one of the co-founders of Make Votes Matter, when in 2015 he launched a petition to bring in proportional representation, which ultimately got almost 300,000 signatures, I think. So really key part of the MVM team. We also have Sandy Martin, who is the former MP for Ipswich and is the current chair for the Labour campaign for Electoral Reform. Followed by Helen Belcher. She is the former parliamentary candidate for Chippenham for the Liberal Democrats and is also one of the key members of our cross-party one of our cross-party speaking programme. And then finally, Joe O'Toole. He's also a student activist, and he's also part of the MVM volunteers group working on the social media side of things. So Owen will start and talk about first past the post, why it's bad. Sandy will go through some myth busting and some common answers to some of the arguments. Helen will give us the positive case for PR, and then Joe will do a summary of the different types of systems that are used here in the UK and some other examples from around the world. So with no further ado, I'd like to hand over to Owen to kick things off.
Great, thanks, Emma. I'll just share. I have some slides. But yeah, first I want to say, I think there's 281 people in the call at the moment, which is amazing. And if you told me there'd be 280 people coming to listen to us talk about the arguments about PR when we started this, I'd be amazed. So that is just really cool. Thank you all for coming. So I'm kind of just going to run through the basics of the argument against first past the post. And I'm going to try and keep it quite simple. So if you feel like you know all this, that's amazing, you have a head start, but I wanted to kind of go through the key arguments as I see them against first past the post. So can everyone see the slides? Okay, great. Yeah, so in the UK, we use first past the post, which is also known in some places as single member plurality voting. It's called that because every constituency has a single MP and they're elected by a plurality. So to win, the winning candidate just needs one more vote than whoever comes second. It's also used in the US, Canada, and India, and a kind of smattering of other countries, mostly British colonies, but not very many countries use first past the post. And in the UK, we have 650 constituencies, which you can see on the right. And each of these elect one MP. So, I mean, probably the biggest selling point of first past the post is it sounds simple, but there's a lot of problems associated, as I'm sure you all know, which I'm going to go into. So these 3 points, I don't think are necessarily the strongest arguments against first past the post, but they're kind of like the foundation of why it all goes wrong. So they cause a lot of problems. So to be elected under first past the post, you don't need more than 50% of the vote. MPs in the past have been elected on as little as a quarter of the vote, meaning 75% of people voted for someone else. The second problem is that votes for losing candidates are effectively wasted. So if you don't vote for the winner, nothing happens to your vote. There's no compensation, goes in the bin. And everyone only has one vote, which makes sense. But if you vote for a losing candidate, there's nothing you can do about it. So people are constantly trying to think of the tactics. How can they maximize the power of their vote? Because they know they've got no way of influencing the election if they vote for a loser. So that's kind of where the idea of wasted votes comes from. And this is one of the big problems with first past the post, is that the vast majority of votes in most elections are wasted. So if you vote for a losing candidate, as I said, your vote doesn't really have an influence on the outcome. But also, if you vote for a winning candidate who has more than they need to win, your vote is also effectively wasted. And that leads to people feeling really disenfranchised. I mean, I'm sure many of you, like me, feel that there's not much point in voting when you know that you don't have much influence on the outcome. And this leads to unrepresentative parliaments. So in first past the post, there's no connection between the percentage of votes that a party gets and the percentage of seats that they receive in Parliament. So all of those wasted votes that we've already discussed, they don't influence the final result, and that means that elections are totally warped. So this example is from the 2015 general election, which is probably the most disproportional in British history, when UKIP, the Green Party, and the Liberal Democrats won almost a quarter of votes, but only 1.6% of MPs, which is obviously totally undemocratic, but it also feeds into this disenfranchisement, disenchantment with the system. But they're not just unrepresentative in terms of parties, and I think this is really important to stress. They also fail to represent Britain in terms of things like gender, race, sexuality, and region that MPs are from. So, I mean, I probably don't need to tell you that MPs don't look like the public by and large, and first past the post has been shown by many studies to exacerbate many of the reasons why politicians don't look like the public. Because of unrepresentative parliaments, the kind of flip side of some parties being underrepresented is that the main two parties are generally overrepresented. So we frequently have governments which are elected on a minority of the vote. In fact, there's only been one government since 1945 which received a majority of votes. It was the Liberal Democrat Conservative coalition, and it only governed for 7% of the time. So 93% of the time we have a government elected by a minority. And that problem is kind of getting worse as we have a more multi-party politics. So in 2005, Labour was elected with just 35% of the vote. That sounds bad enough, but if you flip it on its head and think that 65% of people turned up to the ballot box to vote for someone else, and they had no real say after that, Labour got all the power. And this means that policy making doesn't reflect the majority of voters. And in British politics, it very, very rarely do governments make policy that is on behalf of a majority of voters. Another problem with first past the post is that it really emphasizes geography. So as I said at the start, every constituency has one MP. So really elections are decided based on where voters are rather than how many vote for people. So for example, the SNP, they have their voters are very geographically concentrated. So they manage to win a lot of seats with not many votes. Whereas say the Green Party or UKIP in the past, the Liberal Democrats, they tend to get a lot of seats which are spread out and they don't win many seats. Then The Conservatives also tend to do very well because they get a lot of votes, but very kind of evenly distributed across the country, and they scrape over the line in a majority of constituencies. And obviously politics shouldn't be decided by where voters live. Everyone should have an equal say. So part of this problem with geography is that all of politics really is geared towards marginal constituencies. So election campaigns are fought in seats which can be won or lost. And this graph, I'm not sure how clearly you can see, but it basically shows that the number of marginal seats has been falling in recent elections. It's only about 22% of seats really decide the elections, and the rest of the country is mostly ignored. Oh, I think I skipped forward one. And then the opposite of a marginal seat is a safe seat, which comes with its own set of problems. So if one party is really popular in an area and they dominate elections, there's not really any accountability for that MP. They are essentially guaranteed a job for life. There's no way of getting rid of an unpopular MP if they are the only candidate of a very popular party in an area. And I think that breeds a kind of complacency a lot among MPs who don't really fight for their jobs. And all of this really, if I had to summarize it in one main point, it's about inequality between voters. So when I'm speaking to people, I think a lot of people are kind of sick of talking about elections and about what's fair for politicians. So when I talk about first past the post, I really like to emphasize that it's voters who are cheated by the system. So for example, in 2019, it took 866,000 Green voters to elect one MP, whereas for each SNP MP, there were only 26,000 SNP voters. So this is just a massive source of inequality in our political system. And elections and all of politics really is decided by a tiny number of swing voters in a small number of marginal constituencies. And this has downstream implications. So because our politics is so geared around those voters, it's really inevitable that policies aren't aimed towards the majority of the population. So I won't go into too much depth here because I'm aware I'm running out of time, but studies from political science suggest that countries with first past the post do worse on a whole range of issues, from climate policy to income inequality, representation of women and minorities, welfare spending, and even the likelihood of going to war. And also in a more general kind of democratic sense, it leads to lower satisfaction and lower turnout. So yeah, I think I've whizzed through most of the arguments there. I hope that was okay. I'll be happy to answer questions after the others have spoken.
Brilliant, thank you so much, Owen. We will share the slides as well. Hopefully you'll let us have those. I know a few people have asked about that. So that would be really brilliant. Next up, we have Sandy Martin. I hope, Sandy, you're here. And we'll talk about myth bustings and answers to some of the most common questions. So Sandy, are you here? Can you unmute yourself, Sandy? Okay, Sandy, are you here?
I am now, yes.
You are.
Sorry, you weren't allowing me to unmute, so I couldn't unmute myself. Thanks, Emma.
Sandy,
Okay.
Thanks.
Right. Yeah, thanks ever so much, Owen. I mean, that was a great explanation of what's wrong with first past the post. I mean, there was a comment in the chat from somebody from Chorleywood saying that you know, it would take a miracle to make any difference to what people's votes counted in Chorleywood. But that actually is precisely the point, that, you know, a proportional electoral system does give value to every single vote that is cast in a general election in this country, because even if you haven't got the opportunity to vote for a local constituency MP, you will get the chance, your vote will count towards whatever system is used for a proportional election. And so a Labour vote in Chorleywood will count, and indeed, following Owen's graph in his presentation, a Conservative vote in Liverpool Walton would count as well. And actually, there's a very important point which Owen didn't explicitly make, but which I think it needs to be said, is that it's not just people who live in constituencies where they're not going to win. It's also people who live in constituencies where they know the result is going to be for their candidate. So if I was a Labour voter in Liverpool Walton, clearly I would go out and vote Labour in Liverpool Walton. But it wouldn't make any difference to the result, because I would know that the Labour candidate was going to win anyway. So I wasn't actually in a position where my vote helped to make a difference to who was in government. And we think that every vote that is cast by voters during a general election should count towards who is in government, which is why it's not just the people in safe Conservative seats or safe Labour seats. It's in any safe seat, either you're voting for somebody who you know is going to be elected, or you're voting for somebody who you know is not going to be elected. But either way, your vote is not actually contributing to changing the government. And so that's the really important point. And I think the most important point about PR is that every vote counts under a PR system. So I'm going to talk to you about some of the myths about PR systems, some of the myths about changing the voting system that we've got, and how we deal with them, because I think we're all signed up to the idea that we want a better system of elections, but sometimes it's quite difficult to argue with some of the people who say no, we need to keep the present system, and this is why. And the first one is the one that I hear most frequently from my Labour colleagues, is that well, we need to keep the constituency link. And so Labour Campaign for Electoral Reform and the Liberal Democrats and the SNP and Plaid Cymru have all signed up, and the Green Party have all signed up to what we call the Good Systems Agreement, which lays some ground rules for what we will support in creating a new electoral system. And the number one thing for that is that we will not support any system that does not have constituency MPs, because it is important to know somebody that you can contact locally, to have somebody there. And not only that, it's also important to make sure that people are voting for people, because otherwise you're putting far too much power in the hands of party apparatchiks or party officials. And you only have to look at countries which don't, there's not many countries that don't have constituency MPs at all. But if you look at a country, for instance, Israel, which just has party lists and no constituency MPs, what happens is that whenever anybody gets fed up with their own party, they start a new party. You've got millions and millions of parties. The only control on whether or not somebody is a candidate and whereabouts on the party list they are is from those parties' officials, and the voters only get a chance to vote for the party, and they can't choose one good candidate rather than a bad one. And it really doesn't work well in Israel. It certainly wouldn't work well in this country. So we are absolutely sold on the idea that you've got to have constituency MPs. And anybody who says, oh well, we can't have a proportional representation because we don't want to lose the constituency link, you just need to tell them there is no way we would accept not having a constituency link. The next most obvious myth, which we get fed to us over and over again, is that it will let in extremists. And I think that the strongest arguments for that not being an issue with PR is that the first past the post system doesn't prevent extremists from getting elected. But what it does do is it prevents them from being elected as an overtly and transparently extreme party. And I think the experiences with Donald Trump in the United States, and actually I have to say, and my apologies to anybody here who is a member of the Conservative Party, but I hope you will accept that the Conservative Party leadership has had a really serious lurch to the right, and an awful lot of what we might call the more reasonable members of the Conservative Party have actually been expelled. You know, any Conservative Party that expelled people like Dominic Grieve clearly no longer has any interest in trying to create a united country or trying to heal divisions. And the extremists, people like, for instance, Marc Francois, under a system which did not predominantly create two main political parties, I am sure would not be a member of the Conservative Party, but would be a member of UKIP, or even a party to the further to the right than that. So what's happened is not that the extremists have been kept out of politics, but quite the reverse, that the extremists have actually been encouraged to take over the main political parties, which are the only source of power in the country. And if you look at countries where they do have a problem with extremists, but where they have a proportional electoral system, and the best example I can think of is Germany, they have possibly one of the most obnoxious political parties in the entire world, in Alternative für Deutschland, but they have been able to marginalize it. And the reason they've been able to marginalize it is because it's open and it's obvious, it's overt, they know who these people are, and all the other political parties can make sure that they are not given any powers, either regionally, locally, or indeed nationally. The third strong and biggest myth, I think, that we hear, certainly within the Labour Party, about proportional representation is the idea that if you don't have something which gives all the power to one party, you don't get strong and stable governments. Well, we haven't had very strong and stable governments in this country for some years anyway. And again, you know, countries like Germany or indeed New Zealand have had extremely good, strong, stable governments with coalitions under proportional representation electoral system. Anyone who thinks that our country has a stronger and more stable government than the Germans have, I think has probably not been looking at the news. And specifically from the Labour point of view, and you might get some of this from some of the other political parties that have signed up to the Good Systems Agreement, but where individual members of the parties might well feel that, well, you know, we really want to implement our policies. We don't want to implement anyone else's policies. But the overall effect of the alternating thing between two main political parties is very often that one party will tear up everything that has been done by a previous government. And in fact, in the case in this country, the case is that the Conservatives tend to be in government for a lot longer than anybody else. Certainly been in government for a lot longer than the Labour Party has been. And almost all the things that Labour governments do are either watered down or revoked by incoming Conservative governments. And now we can see that they're even trying to do away with the basis of the public National Health Service that we brought in 1945 to 50. So even a really strong and radical government like the 45 to 50 Labour government can have anything good that it does undermined by an incoming radical right-wing government, and a proportional electoral system which produces a much broader representation of views across the country in Parliament is far less likely to have governments that undermine progressive moves that have been done by previous governments. And so rather than having a slight lurch forward and then steps backwards, you have a more progressive, more careful move forwards, which is much less likely to be undermined in the future. The third thing that is brought up sometimes, maybe not quite as much as we might expect, but it is brought up, is the, oh, well, we've already had a referendum. The referendum in 2011 was a referendum on the alternative vote. an awful lot of people don't know what the alternative vote was or what the referendum was about. And when I say that, I am talking from the position of somebody who took part in a debate in Parliament where the Conservative MPs who were arguing about the issue didn't know what the referendum was about. Very, very few people knew what it was about, but it wasn't about proportional representation. So anybody who says, oh, well, you know, we've already had a referendum on proportional representation. No, we haven't. We had a referendum on the alternative vote, which is not PR. The alternative vote is ruled out by the Good Systems Agreement, which we've all the parties that agreed to electoral reform are signed up to. And in fact, the referendum was no more than a beauty contest for Nick Clegg at a time when Nick Clegg was incredibly unpopular across the country. So I think that we need to make it clear that that referendum was nothing to do with proportional representation and does not in any way undermine the campaign that we're doing now. And finally, the one that I want to leave you with is the dislike of coalitions. It is an interesting one because clearly there are times when it has been decided that the best way to make sure that we have the best possible government is to have a coalition, even when it's not necessary. And the best example of a government of all the talents that I can think of in this country was between 1940 and 1945, where Churchill wanted to have ministers from all the parties in the government because he wanted to make sure that there was a government and national unity. And it was partly that which led people to believe that people like Ernest Bevin and the other really significant Labour ministers were able to govern the country in a way. They felt confident in putting their support in those ministers. But the point was that they worked really well with the Liberal Democrat ministers and with the Liberal ministers and the Conservative ministers in that coalition because they all had a shared purpose. Now, obviously, I'm not expecting a government of national unity anytime soon. But where there is a shared purpose, a coalition can be really effective. And I would argue, and I hope that most of the people that you'll be arguing with in the future would agree, that all the parties apart from the Conservative Party do have quite a large degree of shared purpose in this country at the moment. And we really, really need to have an electoral system which enables us to follow that shared purpose. And it's an urgent shared purpose. The climate crisis is not going away anytime soon. So I'll leave it there because I know you've got lots of other great speakers. But, you know, those are 5 good reasons why myths that people come up saying, you know, proportional representation doesn't work are easily answered.
Brilliant. Thank you, Sandy. That was very informative. I hope you all agree. So I think we'll move on swiftly to Helen, who is going to cover the positive case for PR and why it's so important for us to all campaign for a change to the voting system. I think I may have to unmute you, Helen.
Yep, there you go. Thanks, Emma. Well, it's interesting following 2 speakers who've basically given the complete antithesis of what I was going to say. So you've heard it all, but I'm going to try and give it from the other angle. And I was thinking, while Sandy was speaking, I've been involved in campaigning for lesser or greater for PR since the very early 1980s. And one of my friends at university then was the chair of the University Liberal Society. And just for one afternoon, I decided to argue for first past the post and spent a good hour and a half arguing with him that first past the post was the absolute bee's knees of an electoral system. And eventually he gave up and I said, well, you know, actually, no, I think PR is the best thing. He wanted to sign me up on the spot. It took another 30 odd years before I did anything like that. But don't underestimate the arguments for first past the post can appear quite compelling. So it's important that we have very compelling arguments the other way to say why we do need electoral change. So hopefully what I'm going to give you is a few of those. And they seem to me to boil down to two main focuses. One is what the impact on the voter themselves, and the other is the impact on the country, the result of the system, as it were. So starting with the voter essentially under a PR system votes for who they want to vote for. Under our first past the post system, it's a rare contest now which isn't boiled down into some kind of binary, whether that's Conservative versus Labour in the vast majority of seats, or Conservative versus Liberal Democrats in a good number of seats, or SNP versus one of the other parties up in Scotland. But each of the parties in their target seats is essentially trying to condense the battle down to it's them or us. And that is not really an effective choice for a large number of voters. So Emma made the point that I was a Lib Dem candidate in the last two general elections. And I did encounter people who wanted to vote Labour. And it broke my heart every single time when I had to say, well, thing is, would you rather have the Tories or me? Because if you don't want the Tories, then you need to vote for me. And whilst it's, you know, I was trying to give a positive case for voting for me, essentially that's a negative case. Don't vote for them, or if you don't want them, I'm the only option that you have. That's a real travesty of voter choice. So the fundamental point is PR, a good system under the Good Systems Agreement, allows the voter to make a positive choice for the MP or representative that they want. People have talked about safe seats. PR should remove the concept of an MP for life. You get into Liverpool Walton or you get into East Surrey and you are the MP for life, or as long as you want to be there, because those seats never ever change party allegiance. And in fact, the vast majority of seats don't ever change. It's a rare seat that bounces between parties. So and what there has been is some research which shows that this sort of safe seatness, actually it's the marginal seats tend to be overrepresented in things like government spending, and they're certainly overrepresented in terms of the attention that the politicians give them, because those are the seats that are going to win them power. So why would a Conservative concentrate in East Surrey when they can come and concentrate in Exeter, for example, where they've got a chance of unseating the Labour person? So the current system really distorts this, whereas PR gives an equal emphasis to all of the voters in the country. So there's a real priority for parties to campaign everywhere, because there's a possibility for them to win everywhere. And that means that voters feel engaged. They're likely then to have people coming knocking on their doorsteps, actually asking for their opinions. We have a declining voter turnout in this country by and large. It does go up from time to time when there's a particularly close contest being anticipated. But in 2005, when the unrepresentative election that Owen talked about, where Labour won power, quite a substantial majority actually, on 35% of the vote, voter turnout there was a little over 2/3. So it really is imperative that we try and re-engage people. And a PR system, because it's a positive voting system, you're not trying to work out how to get out who you don't want. Lots of negatives there. It's a positive voting system. You're voting for who you want. It then means that people feel their voice can be heard. My brother and I are on opposite sides of the Brexit debate, and he voted for Brexit because, in his words, it was the first time for a long time that his voice would be heard. So he voted. So if we had more positive reasons for people to vote, voter engagement would go up, and then that should lead to better outcomes, better policy making. So those are the aspects from the voter perspective. And the system perspective, and this is actually where most people concentrate. I personally think we should concentrate more on what it's up for the voters. We need to win people. We don't need to win a system over. We need to win people over. But from a system perspective, the ultimate aim is that seats should match votes. And Owen talked about how you get wrong winners. And if votes go up for a party, there's no guarantee that their seats will go up. And there's numerous examples. 2010, the Lib Dem vote went up, but the number of seats went down, which is an interesting paradox. And you get wrong winners. In 1951, Labour got more votes, but the Conservatives won more seats. People think it's always that way around. No, in 1974, Conservatives won more votes, but Labour won more seats. So the system doesn't, under first past the post, doesn't reflect necessarily how people vote. And much has been made of lost votes. Well, in a PR system, every vote counts. Every vote has the prospect to elect somebody, and you get voter satisfaction and voter engagement. So under PR systems, the most votes you're likely to get not counting is about a fifth, as opposed to around a half or slightly over a half, which we currently have. So the key concepts are your seats should match votes, your increase in votes should result in a corresponding increase in the seats. But there are other benefits as well. And Owen talked about these in passing. And it's about PR systems allow for a more diverse parliament in all sorts of different ways, or a more diverse governance structure. So you get more women elected under PR systems. You get more parties represented, so more people feel that their voice counts. You get more communities represented. Now, at the moment, we've had a year and a half, for example, where trans people seem to have been quite a major topic of discussion, both in Parliament and across our media. And yet we don't have any trans parliamentarians at all, not one, no MP, no member of the House of Lords. So it's possible that if you had PR system, then we may get trans people and we may get a more informed debate around that. And Sandy talked a little bit about the polarization of politics. So you have to understand that each political party is itself a coalition. You see that in both the Conservatives, which Sandy talked about, the the Boris Johnson followers have expelled some of the more moderate Conservatives. They certainly did that in 2019. But there was also a battle for the heart of the Labour Party, and there are regular battles about particular policies within all parties. You've got the SNP at the moment going through quite a public split between salmon and sturgeon. But what's holding these coalitions together in the size that they are is largely the first past the post system. So you don't have the concept of having a one nation Conservative as separate from a Johnsonian Conservative. He might disagree with my perception of him as not being a one nation Conservative. So you get these artificial holding together of parties which probably would split under other systems. And then the other point that I would make is that voters' choices and the way that voters see politics is also changing. There's a number of studies on this. An astonishingly large number of people no longer feel represented by any of the mainstream parties. So where do their voices go? So what's unique about England in the UK is that the vast majority of England, outside London, are the only parts of this country without any form of PR at some level of government. Local elections in Scotland and the Scottish Parliament and the Welsh Assembly are elected by forms of PR. So England is unique in that it doesn't have any form of PR at any level. And that then means, again, I mean, Sandy talked about coalitions. Lots of local government actually is run under coalitions of all different stripes. So the idea that coalitions can are ineffective or are not good mechanisms of government is belied by actually what's going on at a number of local governments. And the final point I will say, I did see a comment about this, that some of Parliament has been elected by PR in the past. Up until 1950, universities were represented by a number of MPs, and those seats were elected by the single transferable vote system. Now, there were some drawbacks with them because they were typically quite small electorates. And actually there weren't that many competitions, not many contests within them. But there is a precedent for you having PR within our Westminster Parliament as recently as 1950. It worked. PR is an electoral system or a set of electoral systems for modern day politics. And as I said, people's view on politics is moving away from a truly economic left-right divide to a much more diverse set of axes in terms of how they view themselves. And finally, PR actually has support across the board. YouGov did a poll last year where they asked people of all different parties how they viewed PR, and actually even a majority of Conservative voters favoured moving to a proportional system of elections for Westminster. So there are a number of reasons for moving to a PR system. Hopefully that's given you a few of those.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Helen. Also, as Helen was speaking, I shared a few pages on our website that have a lot of the stats and things that that Helen referred to. So go and have a look at our website if you would like to read it at your own speed. Last but not least, we'll go to Joe. He is going to cover some of the systems. I know there are a couple of questions about how some of the systems work in different parts of the country. So Joe is going to cover that. So I'll hand over to Joe.
Hi, everybody. I've had a couple of issues with Wi-Fi, so I'm really hoping I'm going to stay audible and everyone can hear me and see me all right. The reason I've been asked to sort of talk about sort of some more specific examples of proportional representation systems is mainly because we, as people arguing for this, need to know a little bit about the specific varieties of system that we could end up with, basically for when others bring it up. Sometimes people will want an explanation of how or why some system works the way it does, and then we can explain that to them, and they might feel sort of more reassured and happier about sort of how PR could work out. And sometimes it's sort of raise a concern about something about a certain system that they don't like. And usually if that happens, we can explain that the concern they raise actually doesn't apply to all versions of proportional representation and explain a system that that person might like better. The sort of big takeaway message here is that because there are different types of proportional representation, often something somebody doesn't like about one system does not at all mean that they can't support proportional representation for all of the brilliant reasons other people have laid out about why first past the post is bad, and the principle of proportional representation that seats should match votes is good, and we should adopt a system that delivers that. Designing a voting system is really like a complicated, difficult mathematical thing. You don't need to know all the technical details whatsoever in order to advocate proportional representation. So this is hopefully going to be a sort of quick and understandable bit of a beginner's guide to know enough about the different versions just to answer those questions. So I'm going to talk briefly about party list proportional representation, which Sandy briefly referenced, the additional member system, which is also known as mixed member proportional, the single transferable vote. Those are the main three I'm going to cover, and then I'll talk briefly at the end about the Good Systems Agreement, which Sandy also referenced, and then that should be it. Yeah, if I haven't forgotten anything I was going to talk about. So the sort of the first system I'm going to talk about, the one that Sandy referenced as being not ideal for reasons that we'll come on to, is called party list proportional representation. The way this works is that everybody has one vote and it's for a party of their choice. You might be allowed to pick one candidate within that party, but you're still voting for the party directly. And then once all the votes are counted, each party is given seats that match the share of votes it got. Match the share of votes that it got. And it's kind of that simple. It might be under a system of open list proportional representation that especially popular candidates move to the top of the list. But broadly, the parties then get to choose the top members of their list for however many votes they won. So the party chooses who fills the seats, and they are kind of in control of who specifically gets elected. This system is really used all around the world. There is a gigantic list of countries that use this system. Most democracies use one form or another of list proportional representation. And it does what it says on the tin. It represents all parties fairly based on how many votes they got. But it does mean that you have very limited and often non-existent local representation. And it means that the voters have a sort of limited ability to choose individuals that they want to represent them instead of just parties. Those two reasons are why party list proportional representation, again, to be very clear, not generally considered for use in the UK and not a system that we would support introducing in the UK. Which is largely because a lot of the things that people like about first past the post and the concerns they have about proportional representation are about local representation and the ability to vote for individual candidates, not just parties. So this is kind of the antithesis of what a lot of people want out of their electoral system that they feel like they're getting from first past the post, but they might not really be. The second option I'm going to talk about is the additional member system, or AMS, also known as mixed member proportional MMP in other parts of the world. Under this system, everybody has 2 votes. You vote once for a candidate in your local area, exactly the same way you do under first past the post. And you also vote once for a party, exactly as you would under list proportional representation, the system we just talked about. Then all of the local candidates are elected by plurality, as Owen talked about, same as first past the post. And then basically extra members of parliament from party lists are added to the local MPs that have already been elected, so that the parliament matches the votes on the party list overall. So it means that those local representatives still exist in the way they do under first past the post, but the overall outcome should be the same as if the election had been done under list proportional representation. This is the system currently used for the Scottish Parliament, for the Senedd, the Welsh Assembly, and for the London Assembly, and for general elections in Germany, New Zealand, and a couple of other countries. The advantage here is that you still get proportional representation with all of the benefits we've been talking about, and you keep individual local MPs who are elected as individuals. Having said that, it still uses lists that are controlled by parties to elect some MPs, which some people don't like. And it still has some of the problems that first past the post does, because those sort of first past the post local elections still exist. You still have tactical voting at that level and things like that. So you can imagine this as kind of a mix of first past the post and party list PR that gives us overall still the right outcome, still gives us the proportional outcome, and is often sort of more palatable to supporters of first past the post, or people who don't hate it, basically, as much as some of us here might do. The third and last specific system I wanted to talk about is called the single transferable vote, which you might see written STV. The way this system works is that the ballot, you'll be presented with a ballot which has lots of candidates, all from a range of different parties, some of them from the same party. And then you rank all of those candidates in the order of your preference. You write a number 1 next to your favorite candidate, a 2 next to your second favorite candidate, and so on and so on and so on. When the votes are counted, your vote goes first of all to your favorite candidate only. And then if they don't need your vote, either because they've already won or they have no chance, your vote or part of your vote then goes to your next preference, and so on. So your vote won't be wasted in the way that Owen talked about, because if somebody doesn't need it because they've got too many or can't win, and therefore your vote would otherwise count for nothing, your vote will get transferred. That's what the transferable means. And then each constituency basically gets bigger than it would be under first past the post, but elects multiple MPs. So an area that voted evenly for 3 different parties might have 3 MPs and elect 1 MP from each of those parties. So in that way, the outcome ends up being proportional, because every area of the country has a roughly proportional outcome that kind of is decided by this consensus of votes getting transferred to everyone's next favorite candidate. This is the system used in Northern Ireland for the Northern Irish Assembly and for local elections in Scotland and Wales, for all elections in the Republic of Ireland and in Malta. This also delivers a proportional outcome. It means you don't have some of the sort of tactical voting kind of local issues from first past the post, because you've got this ranked choice ballot, and it lets everyone vote for individual candidates. Some people don't like it so much as the additional member system because the local constituencies still exist, but they are bigger and they all have more than one MP. And some people believe that sort of dilutes local representation, or means that MPs elected by a local area are less accountable. They can kind of shift some blame to the other people who also got elected. Those are kind of the main options. Those last two are the sort of biggest and most popular options that we would advocate as delivering a proportional outcome and maintaining some ability to elect individuals and not giving the parties all the control. The way this is all wrapped up and agreed that we should support a proportional voting system that also meets some other conditions is called the Good Systems Agreement. And Sandy already referred to it, but it's a big cross-party agreement that people have signed. Every party in Parliament except Labour and the Tories, I think. Every Great British party except Labour and the Tories. Lots of MPs, some other politicians and public figures, and campaign groups on different issues. And it establishes a list of 10 principles, including proportionality, constituency links, letting people vote for individuals, and a few more. There are 10. And it also establishes how we think the UK should pick one when the sort of time comes to it that we've agreed that we should have proportional representation. That would be by a citizens' assembly, which is this sort of democratic deliberative process where you select a load of people like you would select a jury, and then you give them all the evidence and you let experts and politicians talk to them and let them make the decision amongst themselves, rather than having a referendum or anything as divisive as that. So what this agreement does is give us a framework to be confident in, that means we can largely postpone the sort of technical specific debate about exactly which proportional system we'd like, in favor of saying we definitely need a proportional system. We should have a proportional system that also meets these other conditions, and good luck trying to tell us that whatever system came out of that would be worse than first past the post. So in that way, we like to avoid getting bogged down in the technical specifics of voting systems. It gets a lot more technical than this, and focus on exactly what Helen was talking about, the persuasive and positive arguments for proportional representation, and what Owen was talking about, the glaring reasons why we definitely need something better than first past the post. Yeah, I think that's it from me.
Thanks, Joseph. That was very much a whistle-stop tour of systems. I know there was an awful lot of information to take in there. I have shared in the chat a few times some links to our website. So if you want details of the Good Systems Agreement, both Caroline and I have shared links to that. There are also pages on our website that sort of go through some of these stats and things like that as well. So yes, I understand there's an awful lot to to take in, but Google is your friend on this as well. So there we go. Right, I will try very quickly to get through some of the questions, although I've been reading some of them and they are quite big questions that are going to be hard to tackle sort of in one go. So the first one that I've spotted is who initiates citizens' assemblies. It varies. I don't know if one of our speakers wants to address citizens' assemblies at all. Oh, we got a volunteer. Am I going to be left with that?
I'm happy to if you want, but
okay, yeah, go on. Thanks, Owen.
Well, I'm not an expert, but I think typically citizens' assemblies are initiated by governments. I mean, I think that's most examples around the world where the results have been implemented have been initiated by the government. But also, I think there are examples where political parties outside of government have run citizens' assemblies to inform their manifesto and then implemented them in power. But I think probably the key thing from the Good Systems Agreement is that all opposition parties, aside from Labour, have signed up, and Labour is on the way to signing up. So I think our expectation as a campaign is that after an election, those parties would get together and would probably have a majority of seats and would then initiate a citizens' assembly collectively, so that it wasn't a partisan process. It was yeah, focused on citizens.
Great, thank you. There's a question about STV, sorry, it keeps sort of jumping. Although STV tends to produce reasonable proportionality, it suggests that it rewards the top 3 or 4 parties in a constituency. So how can STV be preferential and proportional at the same time? Sandy? Oh, sorry, I have to get you to unmute.
You need to unmute me. Thanks, Emma. I mean, I'm happy to mute myself. You don't need to mute me. I can unmute myself. Well,
all right.
Look, there's a lot of argument about STV, and I don't want to go into all of those arguments because I don't want to split the support for getting proportional representation. We are in a contest to get the electoral system in this country changed, and actually a lot of other constitutional things as well. But the electoral system for electing the House of Commons is crucial to that, because we can't do all the other things in this course of one parliament. We need to know that we will have a broadly progressive parliament for the future if we want to do things like changing the House of Lords, making sure there's real power for local government, and all the other things that we would like to do. And this is a contest where we have got to get some form of PR for the House of Commons. If we start arguing now about which form of PR we are going to go for, then we almost certainly won't get there. But I would just say about STV that STV is as proportional as the size of your constituency makes it. So if you have a constituency with 7 MPs in, the likelihood is that there will only be 3 parties represented. Take, for instance, my own county of Suffolk. If we had a proportional election for Suffolk, we would have 4 Conservatives, 2 Labour and 1 Liberal Democrat. As it is, we've got 7 Conservatives. But there's no input for the Greens. There's no input for other parties. So, I mean, my view is it's not as proportional as I would like to see. But the other point about the complicatedness, you know, I mean, we're not talking about it being complicated for anybody in this group. I am quite sure that every one of the 261 participants for this session would be easily capable of doing exactly what they wanted to do in an STV vote. But the evidence that I have seen from the Irish elections is that people with a less socioeconomic, less wealthy and lower levels of educational attainment tend to vote for less people. So that you have a situation where the 3rd and 4th choices tend to fall to people who are more in tune with the way the system works. And I don't think that's healthy. I think we want to have a system where people know exactly who they're voting for and why. And I think that an additional member system makes that more likely. Now, there are people in this call I know who would rather see an STV system. I don't want us to split up, and that's why I think, although we need to be aware of what the systems call for, I think to try and choose one system over another at this stage would be deeply unhelpful.
Great, thanks, Sandy. There's also a question about the Labour Party, which I guess Sandy would possibly be best placed to. I think, I'm sorry to sort of come to you again, but obviously the Labour Party does benefit from first past the post, or it has done in the past. That sort of benefit is dwindling a little bit. So how can we get, hang on, let me actually read the question properly. What is the incentive for the Labour Party to go to back PR, basically? Hang on, oh, try now.
Thanks, Emma. I don't know what the system that you're using for the Zoom is, but I mean, it would be really helpful if you didn't make it impossible for you to unmute myself. Yeah, look, the 75, we know that 75% of the members of the Labour Party support PR. Several polls have been done. There was a YouGov poll done just before the last general election. In fact, people think, oh, maybe it's because of the last general election. No, it was before the last general election that showed that over 75% of the members of the Labour Party supported having a proportional electoral system for Westminster. And we've also got the solid commitment of over a third of the constituency Labour parties in this country to putting a motion to our conference. Now that's, I mean, that's really big. You know, you getting more than half of them would be even bigger, but you don't need to get more than half of your constituencies to sign up to passing a motion in order to get the motion passed. What we do need to do, obviously, is we need to make sure that we've got significant support from the trade unions as well, because the Labour Party, as most people know, is a shared power between the Labour Party members and the trade unions, but we're well on the way to getting that as well. So I think that there is a real opportunity this year to get solid commitment from the Labour Party for proportional representation. And again, I wouldn't want us to commit to any particular electoral system, because we need to negotiate with the other parties and with the population as a whole as to what electoral system would work best. But I am hopeful that it will be something along the lines of the Good Systems Agreement, so that we all know that it will be more proportional and it will have constituency MPs and it won't use a party list system. Sorry, I'm not sure if I answered the question there, Emma. I went off on a tangent slightly.
But I think so. I think Helen has just said she'd like to come on that point as well. So Helen, if there's something that's been missed, hopefully you can unmute yourself. Oh, go on, try now.
There we go. That's it. Yeah. I mean, I think there's a numerical reason why Labour probably needs to get on board as well. If one of the biggest swings towards Labour was in 1997, when Tony Blair was elected Prime Minister, a huge swing, took out a Conservative majority, a small majority, but a majority government nonetheless. Now, if Labour was to replicate that swing now, all they would succeed in doing is taking the majority away from the Conservatives. They wouldn't end up with a majority themselves, let alone 401 seats, which is what Tony Blair won in 1997. Added to which, you have the almost complete dominance of the SNP under first past the post in Scotland, which is where Labour were historically strong. So people often say, oh, it's impossible for Labour to win in England and Wales alone. That's not actually true. In 1997 and in 2001, Labour did win more seats in England and Wales than the other parties. But it's rare, it's not often. So if we take Scotland out of the picture, then it's very difficult to see a route back for Labour into government without some form of PR. Given the current political situation, which shows no sign of changing. I mean, in 1997, there was an expectation that there would be some move towards PR. And Roy Jenkins was commissioned to head up an inquiry into PR and recommended a form of sort of AV plus, so sort of alternative vote plus sort of top up seats. Which was then quietly sort of shifted into the long grass, never to be seen again. And if you were in the Labour Party at the time, why would you have bothered? Because you were so politically dominant for a good decade that there was no reason to consider it. But I do wonder whether Tony Blair and the Labour leadership then is rather like David Lloyd George was in the 1920s, when he fully regretted not introducing PR in the 1920s when he was Prime Minister.
Great, thanks, Helen. Another question now, you mentioned Scotland, so that's quite topical at the moment. I think this would be possibly between Owen and Joseph. So with the new Alba party just starting up, they appear to be trying to game the AMS system. So has this possibly exposed a flaw to the AMS system? Owen or Joe? Or
yeah, sure, I can. Yeah, I've looked at this question a bit because I think it is interesting that they're trying to kind of game the system. And one thing that I think is probably missed in the discussion about it is that even if the Alba Party is completely successful and every single independent supporter voted Alba on the list and SNP in the constituencies, which is what they're trying to do to maximise the pro-independent seats, the end result would actually still be more proportional than first past the post in Scotland or the first past the post element of AMS in Scotland. The reason that they're trying to game the system is that the SNP win virtually every seat under the first past the post section. So if there was no proportional element, there would be nothing for Alba to game, but also the system would still be more disproportional than if Alba is successful. So yeah, I mean, it shows a slight flaw, I think, in that there is a theoretical possibility of Alba winning some seats at the expense of unionist parties, but it's nothing compared to the disproportionality and the kind of warping effect of first past the post.
Thanks, Owen. Helen was waving madly last time as well.
Yeah, I was going to say basically what Owen said. I think people had talked to me about sort of combining some form of single transferable vote with a sort of AMS top-up, which was appealing. And then I'd actually heard the week before Salmon set up Alba, what happens if you get two parties which act in collusion to game the system. And I think, yes, it would be more proportional, but it would still be a disproportional result, because you could theoretically have 75% of the seats going to 50% of the vote. And that is a problem, because then you have minorities squashed out big time. So I think for me now, this has kind of proved a big, without wanting to get too hung up on systems, this has proved a big flaw to AMS, which I hadn't considered until about 2 or 3 weeks ago.
Andy as well. Hopefully you can mute yourself.
Yeah, thanks. And if I could just come in on that. I mean, one of the problems I think is having two votes. You don't have to have an AMS system with two votes. If you have just the one vote, then your vote will count towards electing somebody local, but it will also count towards the party of that local person. I can't see a good reason for allowing people to stand on a proportional basis if they're not putting forward anybody locally. And a one vote AMS system would actually do away with this problem altogether.
Great, thanks, Andy. I'll ask one final question. I know we're over time, so it'll just be one final question, and then we'll wrap up. I'm going to paraphrase because I saw the question earlier on, and it was essentially about how can we as campaigners for PR, even though we may have different party affiliations, different sort of political affiliations, how can we all work together without sort of arguing over the details and really pushing for PR as a general concept? Does anyone want to tackle that one? Joseph, we haven't heard from Joe very much.
Great. Yeah, I think that there are kind of there's a more kind of sneaky answer to this, and then there's the sort of good principled answer. I think the sort of overarching principled answer is that you know, proportional representation should mean the best for you know, the best for every voter, and, you know, equal reward for parties based on how many votes they get. And that should be perfectly saleable to anybody, regardless of their partisan affiliations. Most people, regardless of what party they support, are Democrats and do like, you know, do like the idea of everyone being represented evenly and fairly. And a lot of people's kind of willingness to get cynical and try and game systems and things like that is because they perceive that there's an unfairness against their party already. If they thought everything was fair, they wouldn't have that problem. The more kind of the sneakier thing is that lots of partisans who, you know, and this is true. This is true in my party. It's true, I think, in most parties. Is that people who support one party very strongly tend to believe that everyone should vote for their party, and therefore if you tell them, well, under proportional representation, we could win as many seats as we could win votes without having to worry about safe seats and marginal seats. And we can go out and we can convince, we can convince as many people as we need. That is often quite persuasive. And obviously that can't be true for every party at once, that they're all going to sweep the board as soon as there's a fair voting system. But if somebody is sort of very attached to, well, will this benefit my party or not? You can say, well, do you believe in your party or not? Because if you do, then you'll do great under PR because everyone will agree with you. So if there's a sort of more pragmatic answer to, how can we bring people in regardless of what party they're from, you can convince nearly anybody that PR will be beneficial to their party.
Sorry, I unmuted myself. Oh, Helen, would you like to come in on that?
Yeah, I mean, what's impressed me about Make Votes Matter over the past 5 years is actually how well it does work across political parties, and how people within the room do actually talk properly with each other. And for me, it models how politics ought to be. Now, sure, it's on one issue, but by heck, it's a core issue, isn't it, for our country, the way that we're governed? Absolutely fundamental to everything else, addressing climate change, housing development, education, whatever you want. But the way we're governed is absolutely central to it. And that's what's impressed me about MVM is how it does encourage those grown-up discussions whilst allowing for different political viewpoints in the room. I never expected to be in the room with the leader of UKIP, Labour MPs, president of the Liberal Democrats, and a Conservative and a group of independents. But they're all talking, or we were all talking about the Good Systems Agreement. We created a document that works, and I think everybody in that room was happy to sign up to. So I think, it happens, it's there. MVM is providing a model for it, and I'm sure there will be other models as well. So it's doable, it's achievable.
Brilliant. Thanks, Helen, for that amazing endorsement. Just to say about the Labour Party, we are working very hard on the Labour Party. Sandy is one of those key people, but there are many of us. And we are very hopeful that this Labour Party conference, which is in September, will be the turning point to get Labour to include support for PR in their policies. So there are many dozens, if not hundreds of people working behind the scenes to get that done.
Thanks, Emma. Yes, I mean, there's several people who said, what is the prospect of getting the Labour Party to change? We know already that the majority of the Labour Party members are in favour of proportional representation. We're hopeful that we can get the majority of trade unions to support it. And we are very confident about having a meaningful debate and getting a motion passed at conference in the autumn. I don't think our party can continue to ignore the views of the majority of its members, and especially in a situation where, if we want to have a progressive politics in this country, we have got to change the electoral system. And can I just, I'm sorry, it's very rude, Joe, but I mean, I'm just going to summarize what you said just now, which is, if we have a proportional electoral system, everyone can vote for the party they really believe in. And surely that's worth fighting for.
Absolutely, definitely. Well, on that note, thank you. I think it's possibly time to wrap up. I know we're a little bit over time. Thank you for sticking with us. It was brilliant to have so many people on the call. We had up to 300 people joining us today, which was absolutely fantastic. I really hope that you've enjoyed it. Please check out our YouTube channel where we've got videos of all the different events that we've done, including the talk with John Curtis last week, other briefing sessions and other sort of information and training sessions that we've done as well. So please go and check it out, and we'll upload this video up there as soon as we can later this week. But thank you very much. Please continue to campaign for PR. There's all sorts of things for you to get involved in. So if you're on our mailing list, you'll get regular updates on what we're up to. Thank you to our wonderful speakers. So thanks to Owen, to Sandy, to Helen, and to Joseph. I think they were all excellent. So thank you very much to everyone for joining us. Caroline has been our little chat monitor as well. So it's been great to have everybody. But thanks very much. We will, of course, tell you about any more training sessions coming up. I know that people have been asking for various things, so we're trying to accommodate as much as we can. But for now, I think that's all, folks. Great to see everyone, and look forward to seeing you again. Thanks. Bye-bye.